Before the break, we were talking about the Apollo 11 lunar landing hoax and how you became interested in it. You had have a background in photography, so you kind of honed in on the photographic evidence because, I mean, that's an interesting area. There were, something like 30,000 photos taken on the lunar surface, supposedly?
That's right. Yeah.
And who was the principal photographer? Was it Buzz Aldrin or was it Armstrong?
Well, on Apollo 11, most of the photographs were taken by Neil Armstrong. There's an interesting story behind that because how many people can actually identify a photograph of Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface? There is apparently one which shows his back view in the distance, which is a bit weird when you think of it. He's probably one of the most famous men in the 20th century. He passed away 4 years ago. Instead, he was buried at sea off the coast of Florida for various reasons. But there were 121 photographs taken on the lunar surface during Apollo 11, which is weird because there were actually two cameras. There was one camera for each astronaut. But on Apollo 11, only one camera was used. They were Hasselblad cameras. It's a very good camera. Not an ideal choice because Hasselblad cameras are medium format. Most people are familiar with 35mm cameras.
Right.
Hasselblad are the next size up. They're medium format, 70mm square. And they were clipped to their chest. They had a mounting point on the chest so they could keep their hand free to pick up the rocks and salute and wave the flag about. Sorry, I'm being a bit flippant here, aren't I? I should be more respectful, I suppose. But considering none of it happened on the moon, I think we can probably excuse that. In fact, finding the photographs, this was 20 years ago, before the internet had all the photographs posted. Finding a copy of these Apollo photographs was actually quite difficult. I had to go to an astronomy show in London to find them. And I got half a dozen copies, half a dozen different photographs. I started looking at them and I thought, hey, these are great photographs. These are spectacularly good photographs. Now, I've used a Hasselblad camera myself and I know that they produce very, very good images if you get it right.
Right.
But, most people obviously today would be familiar with digital cameras. The Apollo photographs were not digital images. They were all taken on film.
Right.
Again, that's another difficulty because you have to develop the film, which means you've got to go and process it. So if you take it on the moon and you process it, how do you know you've got the exposure right? Because it didn't have an exposure meter. So the more I uncovered about the limitations of this camera, though it's technically a very good camera, it's a very hard camera to use. It had no exposure meter, except for a little chart that was clipped to the top of the camera. So if you pointed towards the sun, you had one exposure. If you pointed away from the sun, you had a different exposure, which is quite routine. But you had to focus it by hand, set the aperture by hand, and the shutter speed.
With those big gloves on.
With what, in effect, were armored gauntlets.
Right.
Now, how many people could guarantee to get good photographs with a Hasselblad camera while wearing heavy-duty gardening gloves?
And how do you look into the viewfinder? How do you look into the viewfinder with that big helmet on?
Well, you haven't got a viewfinder.
Aha.
They took the viewfinder away because you couldn't look at it with your helmet on, because on a Hasselblad, the viewfinder is on the top of the camera. And because you can't get your head down close enough, they said, oh, forget the viewfinder, we'll just take it away. Just point it in the general direction of the subject you want to photograph. It'll be okay. I mean, for God, look, come on, guys, get a grip.
You know how many, my grandmother, God rest her soul, who had that, the flip, the viewfinder on top that you would flip, had the big flash pod on the side. And even with that, God rest her soul, she was cutting off heads left, right, and center every Christmas, Thanksgiving. And she had the advantage of a viewfinder.
It's easy to cut heads off. You're quite right, because, all right, on this particular Hasselblad camera, they were using a semi-wide-angle lens. It was a 60-millimeter
Okay, so it's forgiving.
lens. So it's slight wide angle. It's the equivalent of a 35-millimeter lens on a 35-millimeter camera.
Mm-hmm.
Slight wide angle. But it still has to be pointed in the right general direction. And if you look at the photographs of Apollo 11, and you mentioned there are over 30,000 actually taken on the lunar surface by the other Apollo missions, or right through to Apollo 17, very, very few photographs are very bad. Most of them are quite acceptable in terms of what they show.
Right.
And when they show the other astronaut, one astronaut taking a picture of another one, you don't get heads cut off. You don't get off-centered images, which you'd expect. Now, what you would then do, because you're in a place you've never been to before, you've got lighting conditions which are probably a bit tricky, you would do what's called bracketing.
Yes.
Now, bracketing means that you would take the exposure you think is right, and one slightly above it, one slightly below it. On the time they spent on the lunar surface, they were taking one photograph every 50 seconds, which doesn't sound a lot. You think, well, one photograph every 50 seconds. But they had a lot of other things to do as well, like collect rocks, salute, and plant flags, and drive around in little rovers, and get in and out of the lunar lander. So they had a lot of things to do. And the more I looked at the photographs, the more I looked at the images, the more questions arose, like, why in some cases can you see very clearly in what is obviously shadow? Now, the famous sequence of photographs which shows Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder from the lunar lander, being photographed by Neil Armstrong.
Yes.
He's actually in shadow at that point.
What would be creating the shadow?
Well, it's the shadow of the lunar lander.
Okay.
So he is in shadow. I mean, you can see the sunlight behind him. It's fairly clear. And I think, well, okay, so they must have used some sort of flash gun to get the amount of light into his features so that you could see who he was and what he was doing. And
right.
He's coming down the ladder, right? Then I found out they didn't have any flash guns. They didn't have any reflectors. They didn't have any additional lighting. So where did all the light come from? Oh, it's obviously light reflected off the lunar surface. I think, no. Knowing enough about the photographs, and these are a photographic film, they're not digital. If you can get the highlight of light on the surface of the moon behind the lander correctly exposed, you would expect anything in shadow to be in such deep shadow you couldn't see any detail. And this was not the case. So there's something very, very strange going on.
I had another question about the actual operation of a camera, even if it is what's a Hasselblad worth? About 20 grand?
Well, about 15, 20 grand.
Yeah.
That's about. In fact, most of that is for the lens, which is actually a very, very good lens made by Zeiss.
But even with an expensive camera, and I understand the only automatic function on that camera was the film winder to advance the film, right?
That's correct.
So, with the mechanics of a camera, I take my iPhone 7 out, and if it's, just even above freezing, it just shuts down. What's the temperature on the surface of the moon?
On the surface of the moon, in sunlight, about 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 degrees centigrade.
120. Right.
It's like it's hot. It's very hot, because there's no atmosphere to diffuse the sunlight. Given that the sun is 93 million miles away, the Earth and the moon get about the same amount of sunlight, but because there's no atmosphere on the moon to diffuse it, you get the full energy of the sun. If you're in the shadow, it's minus 120 degrees centigrade.
Right, minus 120.
It's like colder than any other place on Earth. The coldest place on Earth is in Siberia. It's minus 62 degrees centigrade.
Well,
on the moon, it's minus 100 degrees centigrade.
That leads me to my question. I mean, how would they have to? They would have had to have adapted that camera to withstand those temperature fluctuations. Otherwise, I'm thinking it wouldn't operate.
Well, exactly. Again, this was something which, once you start looking into the detail of it, it starts to become obvious that there are a lot of unanswered questions. Now, obviously, the thing to do would then be to ask NASA if they could provide some suggestions as to how these things would work under those conditions. But when you realize that NASA stands for never a straight answer, that's what you're going to get. There's no point in asking. They're not even prepared to address the issue. I've tried. In fact, I approached NASA and said, look, this was about 20-odd years ago when I started on this. I thought, these spacesuits they've been using, wandering around on the lunar surface, and we haven't even started talking about radiation yet.
Van Allen belts, right?
Van Allen belts. These spacesuits, which obviously protected all the astronauts from the dangers of radiation in space, which are quite severe. Could these same spacesuits, I thought, be used by technicians to go into Chernobyl, which had just happened, a 3-mile island, and clear up the mess? Because radiation is radiation.
Right, right.
If they can protect it from the galactic cosmic rays and the solar particle events and all the photons and protons and electrons and all the other ons that go on in space, surely we could just use these magnificent spacesuits and go and clear up the mess. And so I contacted the manufacturers of the spacesuit, which is a company called Hamilton Standard, part of the International Latex Corporation, people who make bras. And they said, we built the spacesuits, we made the spacesuits according to the specification that NASA has provided. You better address your question to them.
All right, we were talking about the photographs and exhibit number 1 in your case against the Apollo 11 lunar landing. Just a slight side road here, and then we'll wander back to the main points of the discussion. But you took your evidence in your presentation right into the lion's den a few years ago. You went to the Interplanetary Society, I think it was in Liverpool at the time. And these are, I mean, that society, that's like Arthur C. Clarke and astronomers, and these are hard-boiled scientists. Why did they invite you, and how did you feel when you walked in there to tell them the lunar landing was a hoax?
Terrified. Into the lion's den it was. No, it was very, very interesting, that one. There'd obviously been quite a lot of discussion. As you say, the British Interplanetary Society is the oldest and longest established society of its type in the world. And it was founded and set up originally in Liverpool, in the north of England. Very good football team they have as well, by the way.
I've heard.
It was set up in 1933, and some of the major people involved, Arthur C. Clarke was one, Patrick Moore was another. Many people, in fact, Neil Armstrong is an was an honorary member. Buzz Aldrin has been there. Ed Mitchell's been there. Many of the astronauts have been there. And I got invited because I've done many talks, many presentations, which I like doing. And they'd obviously heard about me and invited me to come and explain my position. Now, this was then announced in the British Interplanetary Society have regular speaking sessions, usually about one every 2 weeks or so. They have somebody talking about astronomy, which is the main subject, talking about space travel, talking about all different types of aspects of space. And this was obviously one that they felt was appropriate for the society. So they announced it on their website and in their magazine called Spaceflight. And all hell broke loose. How on earth could this venerable society invite a hoax believer? That's what I am. I'm a hoax believer. To address it, it would denigrate the society. Anyway, once all the fuss had died down, there was quite a bit of fuss. They said, right, well, we're going to change it slightly. We won't have you just you talking. We're going to have a debate. You can present your case, and then we'll have one of our esteemed members present the other side and will refute everything you say.
You said with confidence.
So that's how it started. We had 20 minutes each. I could present my side of it. The other side could then refute everything I said, tear me to pieces, make me look a complete idiot, which they singularly failed to do. We then had a question and answer session, which lasted about an hour, which was quite unexpected. And the main criticism of the person refuting what I had to say was that he didn't do it. He didn't refute anything I said. He wandered off on his own little talk, explaining what a wonderful thing Apollo was and how extremely fascinating all the astronauts were and how, of course, NASA would only tell you the truth. So how can you believe somebody who comes along and says they don't? So...
Did you change any minds?
I don't know if I changed any minds, because what one has here is called confirmation bias.
Yes.
People will believe and continue to believe what they believe, despite any evidence presented to the contrary. The standard thing which many people do in this area and other areas, they don't play the ball, they kick the man. So
right.
I was being attacked personally, which is fine.
Yeah.
I'm big enough and old enough and ugly enough to not worry about it.
Well, it is a sensitive area because, it is one of those sacred cows, particularly because, people died in the Mercury program and the Gemini program in this space race. And so I guess people feel that somehow what you're doing is denigrating not only this great accomplishment, and I know this is not what you're doing, but this is what I'm assuming is where a lot of the vitriol comes from, that you're somehow, tainting the legacy, including those that gave the ultimate sacrifice.
That's a very good summary, actually. That's very accurate. It's one of those iconic areas, the Apollo moon landings. And the number of people who've said to me, it's because of the Apollo moon landings I got into the science areas, and that's why I do the job I do today. People really feel that they owe the Apollo missions a lot of what their life has turned out to be, which is fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. It was a very good demonstration of the use of science, because what we saw, or what we thought we were looking at, was an incredible achievement. I would love it to be true. I really would. I would love it to believe that man has landed on the moon. I can quite understand that if somebody comes along and says, "Nah, I didn't. Nah, it's all fake," people get quite upset. And we've seen people being upset actually recently in the American elections, haven't we?
Yes, indeed.
I'm
trying to think of it, the comeback to that, the plausible explanation that yes, we landed on the moon, or the Americans landed on the moon, but in order to prevent some sort of a public relations catastrophe, that the pictures didn't turn out, that the television feed was cut or didn't transmit properly, that they did in fact shoot all of that on a sound stage somewhere in order to it's the equivalent of I guess kicking the 1-point convert after the 6-point touchdown. They couldn't risk not having something to show the world, photographs, the television feed, and so that was done beforehand. Is that not a possible explanation?
Absolutely. That's a very plausible situation. Because don't forget that this was the famous space race, wasn't it? And John Kennedy, who had made his original announcement back in May 1961, land a man on the moon before the decade is out and all that, the decade was rapidly coming to the end. They had to be seen to achieve their dead president's challenge, which is fine. 400,000 people worked on Apollo at the height of the program. They weren't party to any of this. Very, very small number of people would have been involved. So what you've got is a situation where it has to be seen to be done.
Yeah.
It's all going to be shown live on television. Now, in the 8 years between the announcement of the program and the completion of it in July 69, there was a lot of training, a lot of preparation, a lot of work to be done. Part of that work would have been real-time simulation of the missions.
Mm-hmm.
It's a logical thing to do. They had simulators of the lander, they had simulators of the command module, and they did real-time simulations. So if the mission was going to take 8 days, they had a simulation for 8 days, so everybody could get the idea of what was going to happen. These were all filmed. These were all photographed, obviously. So you could debrief them and say, look, when you come down the ladder bars, don't put your foot there, put it there. You fall off. This is normal, practical things to do. Of course they were photographed. Of course they were filmed. Now, if what happened was that they took off, as we all saw, they flew to the moon, they got out, they walked about, they took the photographs, talked to the president, collected some rocks, waved some flags, came back again. Oh, let's develop all those photographs you've just taken. So they developed the photographs. Oh, shit, what's happened? Oh, we forgot the radiation. It's fogged the film.
That's right.
If that had happened, and NASA had come up and said, sorry guys, we forgot about the radiation. The film got fogged. The photographs didn't come out. But this is what it looked like, because when we did the training exercises, we got it as close as possible. Neil and Buzz and all the other guys, they'll tell you this is what it looked like. If that is what they had said, I would have no problem with it. But it's not what they said. NASA said these photographs were taken on the lunar surface. I contend they could not have been, because their film would have been fogged by the radiation and the heat. The batteries wouldn't have worked. They wouldn't have been able to get to the moon because they'd have been incapacitated by the radiation in the Van Allen belts. The rockets didn't work properly, we know now. They were not powerful enough. And have you heard the story of the Apollo 13 capsule that the Russians got hold of?
That they got hold of? No. I
Yep.
mean, we all remember the Apollo 13 mission.
That's a wonderful story, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean...
It's the space rescue story.
Right. I mean, by this time it was so mundane, they weren't even televising it live.
Wasn't it a great film that Tom Hanks got hold of?
It's a wonderful film. A little bit of myth-making, I'm guessing.
Definitely. Now, back to real-world time here. April 1970. April the 11th was when Apollo 13 launched from Cape Canaveral. It wasn't called Cape Kennedy until 1973.
Right.
1970, April. Apollo 13 launched. It went somewhere. April the 12th, 1970, in the Bay of Biscay, which is off the coast of France and Spain,
Right.
a Russian submarine is observed by a Canadian ore carrier. And this Russian submarine is in some difficulty. There's 2 other ships near it, Russian ships, because there's a big Russian naval exercise going on. Somehow, an Apollo command module is seen floating in the water and is taken on board a Russian fishing vessel. Now, that is a euphemism for a spy ship. Remember the Pueblo?
Yes.
That's the American equivalent of the Russian trawler.
Ah.
This is a real Apollo command module. It is taken by the Russians to Murmansk, on the north coast of Russia. In September 1970, the U.S. Coast Guard called the South Wind pays a courtesy visit, we're told, to Murmansk, where it collects this Apollo command module. It's strapped to its deck. It was pre-planned, this visit, because the U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the South Wind, normally had a 5-inch gun on its front deck. This gun had been removed to allow space to stow the Apollo command module, which weighs about 6 tons, 7 tons.
Wow.
It goes, the South Wind goes to Murmansk for 3 days. It takes on board the command module. There are photographs to show it. This isn't some weird story. This is for real. This is reported throughout Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then. It's not reported in America. I wonder why.
So what happened to Lovell and Swigert and Hayes, the crew? Were they sent back to the U.S. quietly?
That's what it appears that the submarine was doing. It was taking them on board.
And then they were returned to the United States?
They were returned. Or they were not in the capsule in the first place.
Aha. There we go. Listen, we'll have to leave Apollo 13 for another day, and we'll do that. We'll delve into it even further. Marcus, a real delight finally making your acquaintance and having you on the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I've really enjoyed it.